So it's my pleasure to begin the last session, the last keynote for this conference. If you can indulge me, I would say that this speaker represents, for me, one of the most common and misused nouns in Washington, D.C. He's a friend. And in Washington, D.C., we tend to elevate our acquaintances, even our enemies, to the status of friendship. Aaron is a true friend. Aaron David Miller and I have also worked together. He's an amazing scholar, but beyond his scholarship and his incredible intellect, I've always admired his humanity and his compassion. Aaron David Miller is an Middle East analyst, author, and negotiator. He is vice president for new initiatives at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and has been an advisor to both Republican and Democratic secretaries of state. He is also a global affairs analyst for CNN. Miller worked for the United States Department of State for 24 years. Between 1988 and 2003, Aaron served 6 secretaries of state as a key advisor on Arab-Israeli negotiations, where he participated in efforts to broker agreements between Israel, Jordan, Syria, and the Palestinians. In the year 2003, Aaron departed government service and served as the president of Seeds of Peace, an international youth organization founded in 1993. In 2006, Aaron David Miller joined the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars in Washington, D.C., first as public policy scholar and later as vice president for new initiatives. In 2014, Miller published his 5th book, The End of Greatness: Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Need Another Great President. Today, Aaron is going to talk to us about how America's foreign policy mirrors our domestic economic policies. Please join me in welcoming my friend, Aaron David Miller.
Well, first of all, to Gary, it was Harry Truman who said that if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. But the truth is, and Harry Truman meant it, and sadly and unfortunately, having lived in the nation's capital for over 40 years, it is true. It's at times a shark-infested environment where people don't get to make many mistakes. But I must say, you are fortunate to have Gary Officer. He is a man of extraordinary intellect, honesty, empathy, and commitment. And I think he all of this has the virtue also of being true. It's not false flattery. He really is a singular individual, and it's an honor for me to call him my friend. I also want to thank him for the opportunity to get away from Washington, although I am here for less than 24 hours, because I never thought that I would ever say that the city in which I've lived for almost getting to be well into the 5th decade is more complicated than the foreign policy in the world that I've sought to analyze and help make a better place over the course of the last 25 years working at the Department of State, and then for the balance, since '03, that's 15 years, being part of the public education and conversation. I take the public conversation extremely seriously. When I left the State Department in '03, Colin Powell, a man I admire and respect, gave me 2 pieces of advice. The first piece was don't ever try to come back. That piece of advice made a great deal of sense. I can't even begin to tell you how many birthdays, anniversaries, and children's events that I missed over the years. And those are things you don't really get back. But the second piece of advice he gave me, I rejected wholeheartedly, and that was don't look back. I felt an obligation and a more responsibility to look back, and I miss Michael Jackson. I won't sing it for you, but I will refer to his Man in the Mirror song, and you should look at the video. It's really inspiring. Before you start blaming anyone else for your troubles or the troubles of the world, it's essential to look in the mirror, because all change really begins there. And we made many mistakes along the way. I provided a lot of good advice to secretaries of state and presidents and a lot of bad advice. I remember briefing President Bill Clinton before we went to what would turn out to be a failed presidential summit at Camp David in July of 2000, where we brought the President of the United States, Yasser Arafat, head of the Palestinians, and Ehud Barak, the Prime Minister of Israel, into an environment that was ill-advised, ill-timed, ill-planned, should never have happened. But during that briefing, the President, to his credit, went around the room and asked everybody whether it was a good idea to go. And I was the youngest person at the time there. Secretary of State was there, National Security Advisor was there, all of the President's political advisors were there. And he went around the room and everybody essentially said the same thing. I think they actually believed it. That, Mr. President, you must go. You owe it to yourself, to the country. You were close to the dead Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin. King Hussein also died of cancer a year earlier. You need to go. And when it came time for me to speak, instead of offering the President honest advice, which was, Mr. President, you've already issued the invitations to this summit, so you have to go. But listen to what I'm going to tell you. You will not succeed there. The Israelis aren't ready, the Palestinians aren't ready, and more importantly, we're not ready. So we need to begin planning now, so that at the end of this summit and for the remainder of your term, from July 2000 to the end of the year, we can manage this. I didn't say that. It was not it was probably my least finest hour. Truth to power, I basically took the easy way out. Had I said to the President not to go, or go but you're going to fail, I think there would have been one less member of the delegation going to Camp David. And I rationalized, as so many government officials do in different kinds of administrations, that they stay because they believe they could do more good inside the tent than outside. It can be very compelling and very intoxicating, but it can also be extremely dishonest. So I want to offer you, and I want to leave some time for questions, so I'm going to hopefully stop at 12:30. 7 or 8 observations. I'm not here to sell you anything. My days of selling are over. What I'm interested these days is 2 things which are missing from the human enterprise: clarity and honesty. That's extremely important in marriage, in business, in friendships, and in diplomacy. Clarity and honesty. Because I don't think we'll learn much unless we are clear and honest. So I'm not here to sell you this. If you like some of these things, pocket them. If you don't like some of them, reject them. Hopefully, on balance, you'll find them worthwhile enough to begin to turn over in your own minds whether or not they hold meaning or value. So let's get started. Number 1. I worked for a half a dozen secretaries of state, half a dozen administrations of both political parties. And I voted, full disclosure here, for both Republicans and Democrats since I was 18 years old. And I've concluded that the dividing line for a wise foreign and domestic policy is not between left and right, not between liberal and conservative, and not between Republican and Democrat. It's between dumb on one hand and smart on the other. And the only question that you need to ask yourselves is, which side of the line do you want America to be on? The smart side or the dumb side? Now, I have several pieces of advice on which I conclude to give you. I'm not your rabbi, your priest, your grandparents, your parents, or your kids. I'm giving you unsolicited advice. I realize there's a risk there, but I found these pieces of advice useful for me, so I'm going to conclude with that. But they are designed to raise the possibilities and the chances that we can remain on the smart side. We are now in a argue culture, that's how I would define it, of a tribal nature. It's not just polarization, it's not just partisanship. It's deeply, deeply personal. It has split my own family to the core. Two of my brother's sons are working in senior level positions in this administration. My kids, Jenny Miller, who's 38, and Danny Miller, who's 36, to say they're on the other side of the debate would be an understatement. They both have joined, how can I put this, the resistance. And I am caught in the middle. They will not attend family events in which my nephews are present. They will not attend family events in which my siblings, who I love dearly, my entire family voted for one reason or another for the current incumbent of the White House. And my kids want me to call out my nephews and my siblings. And I've told them that I cannot and will not do that. These are the people in life, as I approach the age of 70, my brothers and my sister, that I cherish. And I will not embarrass them or shame them publicly. So this has really been a very difficult issue. My wife, Lindsay, is on the fence. She understands my point of view, but she also understands where my kids are. Because in the end, it's going to be their America. This is not the first time we've seen the personalization or the tribalization of American politics. In 1856, on the floor of the U.S. Senate, Representative Preston Brooks from South Carolina nearly caned Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts to death. It took Sumner 2.5 years to recover from his injuries, which he eventually did and returned to service in the Senate. Over the issue, Brooks said he had insulted my cousin, but it obviously was over the issue of slavery. And so perspective is necessary here. But rarely, in my experience of working for Republican and Democratic administrations, all of which were partisan in their own way, have I experienced this. I believe, and this will be my message to you from the beginning, that we will get through this. I'm fond of saying we got through blue and gray. We will get through blue and red. I deeply believe that is the case. I truly do. It's a big country. It's hard to transform. The institutions aren't perfect, but at least they're functional. And my overriding theme to all of you is to try to find a way to turn the M in me upside down so it becomes a W in we at all levels of your interaction with yourselves, your family, the work that you do, and certainly on the national level. Second, I know this conference is focused on work and domestic matters, but I want to spend a few minutes trying to create a frame for you on the foreign policy side. So my second observation, I'm from a family who was very adept at real estate. And in real estate transactions, location, location, location is critically important to success. If you want to understand American foreign policy, not just under Republican or Democratic administrations, and not just toward the Middle East, but toward the world, then you have to understand one fundamental point of departure, and that is where we are. What is our location? We are the only great power in the history of the world that is sandwiched between, and I choose my words very carefully, two non-predatory powers. Non-predatory powers. They do not threaten American security, let alone its existence, to the north and south. And to the east and west, we literally have fish for neighbors. What one historian, I wish it had been me, brilliantly described as our liquid assets. These oceans and these non-predatory neighbors explain everything about the way we behave abroad. It explains our arrogance, because our margin for error is unlike any other nation in the world today. We can make mistakes, big mistakes, without threatening our security or even our prosperity. It explains our naivete. I believe that we really do not understand how small powers in the world function, and not just small powers like the Israelis and the Palestinians and the Egyptians, but I'm talking about larger powers like Russia and China. We, unlike any other country in the world, have freed ourselves from the two forces that no other nation, in my judgment, will ever free themselves from. The forces of history on one hand, and the forces of geography on the other. When John Kerry, the former Secretary of State, says that he believes Vladimir Putin is behaving as if he were living in a 19th century world, I'm not entirely sure even John Kerry understands. Vladimir Putin, like every other Russian leader, is responding largely to the forces of history and geography that have shaped Russian foreign policy. Same with President Xi of China. I'm not suggesting that these leaders somehow should be excused, or I'm not justifying the policies they carry out because of their locations. But if we want to have any chance of fixing the world, we have to first understand the realities of those who live in it. And we don't do this. This is, I guess, my final point on number 2. We don't. We idealize and we confuse the fact that somehow what moves us, what's important to us, what should drive us, should drive everybody else. But that's not our experience. And I approach this problem of foreign policy with tremendous humility and respect. 3, leadership. And forgive me here, Marx, not Groucho, but Karl, writing in the 19th century, and he was writing in the 19th century, I doubt if he could have said this today, he said, men make history, and we know that's only partially true, but rarely as they please. It is the interaction between leaders and their circumstances that usually explain why things happen. And we are suffering from a leadership deficit of enormous proportion, let alone leaders who are great. We have no problem recognizing greatness in our scientists, in our Hollywood entertainers, in our athletes, and it's easy to buy tickets for these events. It really is, because we can, on the athletic field, on the stage, in movies, we can see greatness. Where we've lost faith is in the greatness of our political class. I guarantee you, you probably use the word great, I know I do, 10 times a day. Have a great day. She's a great tennis player. Did you see that great movie? But the question is, what does it really mean? What does greatness really mean? I think we've emptied it of a lot of meaning because in our political class, we can't understand and explain what we don't see. I briefed a number of military officers a year or so ago, and I asked them, they're roughly 50, all combat veterans, what political leader in their lifetime would they attach the word great to? American political leader. I gave them more than 20 questions. I gave them 5 or 10 minutes to answer it. At the end of it, they couldn't identify a single individual. And then they, frustrated, they said, well, is this a trick question? I said, no, it's not a trick question. Well, who would you attach that label to? And I said, Martin Luther King. And they said, but he was assassinated in 1968. I said, that's precisely the point. The book I wrote, The End of Greatness, Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President, was an effort to get at this idea of greatness. What does it mean in American politics, and why can't we have another great leader? And the conclusion I came to is we don't want another great president, because when we have great presidents, and we've only had 3 in 240 plus years who could be described as undeniably great, and all of those 3, one in the 18th century, one in the 19th, and one in the 20th, corresponded with the 3 greatest moments of crisis that we faced in this country. And the founders understood this. So they created a political system in which the only thing that could liberate a president to rise to the challenge of greatness was a crisis so profound, so hot, so irrepressible that nobody could sit it out. And we don't want that. That's my basic conclusion. So the argument is we don't want great presidents. If one comes along that can manage a great crisis, fine. We want good presidents. Good in 3 respects. Good in the sense that they're morally and ethically good, in the sense that we use the word. Good in the sense that they know what they're doing. They have capacity. They have character. And good in the sense that they understand themselves, and they freed themselves to the extent that they could from the demons, the character flaws that haunt all of us. This is essential to me. And my argument is that if you want a great president, you need 3 things. You need a crisis, but you also need, once the crisis occurs, a man and one day a woman who has the character and the capacity, the 3 C's of my judgment of presidential greatness: crisis, character, and capacity, to know what to do with a crisis, and then to understand the relationship with the American public. Just a short story. Curiosity is critically important, in my judgment, to leadership. So I'm a young intelligence analyst at the State Department in the 1980s, following Lebanon. The Israelis had just invaded. It was a very critical moment. The Marines were deployed south of the Beirut airport. There would be a tragic attack 25 years ago last week, in which 260 would be killed. And the phone rings, and I pick it up, and the voice on the other end of the line says, it's the White House sit room calling, please hold. So I'm holding 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes. The next voice on the phone. Now remember, I'm a lowly intelligence analyst working to prepare assessments to brief the Secretary of State. So the next voice I hear is the following. Aaron, yes, this is Vice President George H.W. Bush calling. I know you're busy, he says. I know you're busy, but can we spend a few minutes on the phone? I read a memo you wrote on Lebanon, and I want to talk to you about it. So I got off the phone thinking to myself, wait a minute. This man doesn't know what he doesn't know, and he's in a hurry to find out. Curiosity is critically important to leadership, critically important, as is emotional intelligence, which is a fancy way of saying, can I control my own demons, my own sense of selfishness, my own ambition, for the good of the many? Turn the M in me upside down, so it's a W in we. 4th, study history. Why? It's boring. You have to read books. History is important because it guards against, if you know the past, it guards against the 2 mistakes that Americans, leaders, countries can make. It guards against the transgression of omniscience, that we think we know everything, and it guards against the transgression of omnipotence, the notion that we can do everything. Mark Twain, a really smart guy, I wish I could love to sit down just for 15 minutes and have a cup of coffee with him, said that history doesn't repeat. History rhymes. It rhymes. He didn't explain what he meant, but what I think he means is take note of the rhythmic patterns of the past. They never strictly repeat, but there is continuity and value in studying the past. One example, just one, which cost the United States a lot. We occupied Japan from 1945 to 1952 in the wake of the end of the Second World War. Do you know how many Americans, and Japan is a series of islands, do you know how many Americans were killed on mainland Japan during that 7-year period? None. There was not a single act directed against an American civilian or military official during a 7-year occupation of Japan. And remember, up until the late 1960s, they were finding Japanese servicemen, soldiers, on isolated Pacific islands, small ones, who didn't know the war was over and weren't prepared to surrender. So what were we thinking when we decided in March of 2003 to invade a country roughly the size of the state of California population-wise, dismantle its political structure, disband its military with insufficient forces and a woeful misunderstanding of Iraq and how the political trends would play out? I would argue we weren't thinking, which is why we are now stuck in the 2 longest wars in American history, where the standard for victory is not can we win, but inevitably when can we leave. History is important. It guards against arrogance, and it creates a certain measure of respect for the future. 5, we hear a lot of talk about values and interests. The late John McCain believed deeply that our values were our interests. We didn't have a foreign policy unless we promoted those values, and I had the honor of arguing with John McCain several times about this, because I think he was right and also not being realistic. We can never lose the frame of reference of a moral and ethical foreign policy, and we have to live up to it to the best of our abilities. But we also have to understand that our values, our moral and ethical sensibilities probably need to stop at the water's edge. They're not for export. They are not for export. Why? Because our values are geared and oriented toward a unique and special experience that created this country. No other democracy in the world, none, not the Brits, not the French, not the Israelis, could ever have elected twice, and the Europeans accuse us routinely of inherent and structural racism, could never have elected a man of color whose wife was a direct descendant of slaves. Never. We did that. And I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent, that, however imperfect our system is, and it is imperfect, and structural racism still thrives in America. Don't let anyone, and I'm sure you won't, tell you that somehow the problem of race has now been addressed. It's 150 years later, and we still haven't reconciled the promise contained in our own Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal with the reality that the U.S. Constitution, without using the word slavery, embodied the largest single chattel slavery enterprise that the world had ever known. That 150 years witnessed 750,000 Americans dead during the Civil War, all kinds of riots and violence. And it exists today. More on this in a minute. But the reality is our values, even while we can propagate them rhetorically, cannot so easily be applied to other political cultures. First of all, I'm not sure people want them. They certainly don't want them on the back of an Abrams tank or an F-16. Sixth, we hear all the time that America's in decline. I basically reject that notion. I really do. We are not an indispensable power in the sense that we have the keys or should be expected to have the keys to every single problem in the international system. But we will, for the foreseeable future, which is our good fortune, maintain a better balance of economic, military, political, and soft power than any other country. We just have to be smart and deliberate about how we pursue it. Let me conclude with one additional observation. I suggested to you that I have some advice as to how each of us, and I include myself at the top of the list here, could help America remain on the smart side. And I will offer you, again, with humility and respect, 3 or 4 pieces of advice. Number one, do not, please, get your news from any single source. The word prejudice derives from the notion of prejudgment. Why would anyone want to go to a news source that validates their prejudices? I understand why. It's emotionally satisfying, but it's also lazy because it creates no incentive at all to move outside of the comfort zone. And if you envision the world of politics as an unassembled jigsaw puzzle on your living room floor, as I do, the mission, should you choose to accept it, is to try to assemble that puzzle by looking at all the different pieces that fit or don't fit, and to come to your own conclusions. We've contracted out our politics to our favorite cable news channel, and I think it has harmed us. The media mediates too much. On October 22nd, 1962, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the United States faced the real possibility of a nuclear exchange with the former Soviet Union, Jack Kennedy addressed the nation for 1 hour. I'm sure I didn't watch the speech. I was 12. My parents watched it. Do you know that when he finished speaking, the networks went back to normal programming? There were no 6 CNN, Fox, or MSNBC news analysts who, on a digital clock, even before the speech, did a countdown. They didn't tell you what the speech meant. My parents had to look at Jack Kennedy and judge for themselves. Was this right? Now, the downside is that we didn't have then the access to the information that might have helped. But what we've done, I think, is to basically withdraw. You have the power at your fingertips without even leaving your home or your bed to access an amount of information that can help and enable you assemble the jigsaw puzzle while thinking for yourself. Finally, one other unsolicited piece of advice, and forgive me, I'll say it three more times. I'm not here to preach to you. These things help me. They help me now, during a time of great stress and great confusion. Civility. What is civility? It's not just being nice or polite. Civility, in my judgment, is active listening. When you're talking to someone with whom you do not agree, and I mean you really do not agree, and it doesn't happen very often, I know that, because we're all caught in our respective bubbles. Instead of trying to figure out while he or she is talking how you are going to rebut their points with your own talking points, the idea is to actually listen on the assumption that maybe, just maybe, something that your interlocutor said might be of value to you in expressing your own point of view, or perhaps, ideally, but hopefully, would allow the two of you to create a bridge, to begin a conversation to try to solve a problem. I know this is a dark and difficult time. They don't call it the American experiment for nothing. It needs to be worked on. The America that is now is not the America the way we want it to be. The gap is what needs closing. And I'll close myself with a line from the last president who really had an emotional impact on me, Jack Kennedy. I was only 12 when he was murdered. Kennedy described himself, and I borrowed and stolen this, and I urge you to adopt it. Kennedy described himself as an idealist without illusion. Idealism without illusion. Never give up on the hope and the possibility that you, your family, your neighborhood, your community, the world can be made a better place. But as you go through this process of change and transformation, I urge you, because the costs of not doing so are prohibitive, to go through that process with your eyes wide open. Thank you so much.